In this higher design manufacture lesson, we're going to look at research and evaluation techniques. When we look at the course specification document, we can see that research appears both in the assignment section and in the question paper section under research and evaluation. So although it looks fairly brief, in the assignment section we're only asked to carry out and present research. Obviously that's quite an expansive section, and really it's all of the areas that are listed here in the question paper section that are going to allow us to complete these sections in the assignment. So we need to carry out and present research, and the methods that we're going to use are the ones that we're going to learn about for the question paper that are listed here on the right hand side. And that's what we're going to cover in today's lesson. So research will happen after we have analysed our design brief. We'll have been given a design brief, we'll analyse that brief, and we will identify factors that require further research. And generally those design factors are going to include function, ergonomics, aesthetics, market, and performance. Now it's not the case that these design factors will always appear. Sometimes there'll be other factors that might be identified as being more important. But generally the 5 of function, ergonomics, aesthetics, market, and performance are the ones that are most commonly going to appear. These are the factors that are most commonly going to require further research. Research is a vital part of the design process. It's about gathering information that allows us to take our design project forward. Without valid research, without solid, effective research, the design project is ultimately doomed to fail. Research allows us to develop a quality product specification, and without that, that is where the product will fail, without clear guidance in a product specification. So it's really, really important that we don't skip past or rush through the research stage because it is vital to the success of the product. So you can see listed here a lot of the techniques that we're going to have a look at today in this lesson. Before we look at the techniques themselves, it's important that we understand the difference between primary and secondary research. Primary research is research that has been carried out first-hand by the designer. Okay. This means it's been carried out by you yourself or as part of a design team. Okay, so it involves direct contact between the designer and their research. So that might mean that the designer themselves is conducting surveys or questionnaires. The designer themselves might be in the process of conducting a user trial or material testing, that kind of thing. Secondary research comes from an external source. So what that means is secondary research is research that has been carried out by somebody else. Okay, and you are merely interpreting that research. So somebody else has carried out the primary research and you're merely interpreting it. So you're just receiving that information second-hand. Okay, so commonly when we are researching ergonomics, for example, and we take information from an ergonomic data book, that is secondary research. We've not carried that out ourselves, but it's research that we are referencing in our work. So that's really the main difference. Primary research has been carried out by the designer themselves. Secondary research is research that's been carried out by somebody else and the designer is merely making reference to. First technique that we'll look at today is questionnaires. Very, very common technique that is used and one that can generally provide a lot of information due to the variety of the questions that you can ask. Okay, and generally we'll consider 4 types of questions in a questionnaire. First of these is a closed question, which will usually result in a yes or no type of answer or an A, B or C type of answer. So with closed questions, you give the respondent a limited number of options to choose from as their answer. So whether that's yes or no, or whether that's A, B or C, it's up to you. They don't get to give their personal opinion out with the options that you have given. Okay, so that's why we call it a closed question. They're restricted in what they can answer. The opposite of this is an open question, where the respondent is encouraged to give their opinion or their point of view and generally that's going to be an expanded answer, whether it's written or recorded, spoken word, whatever it happens to be, it's going to be an expanded answer, and they can give their own opinion. They can be more difficult to ask open questions, and we'll look at that shortly when we talk about structured questions. So we have to be careful how we phrase those questions to avoid influencing the answer that might be given. We don't want to lead the respondent in a particular direction. We want them to be as honest and as open as they can. So it's important that we word the questions in a way that will allow that. Ratings questions are another type of question that we can ask, and they can help people express an opinion, and they're generally a quicker and easier way than asking an open-ended question. So very simply, the respondent will be given a predetermined scale, say of 1 to 10, and asked to rate a particular factor against that scale. Pretty simple. As I mentioned earlier, we've got structured questions. So when we're asking open questions, it can be quite useful, especially if the answers aren't going to be straightforward, or if there's a lot of information required, that we structure our questions. So if we use a series of structured open questions, which are shorter, rather than one longer question, it can give us the opportunity to prevent the respondent going off at a tangent, to stop them becoming distracted and giving us longer answers that might not be necessary or might not give us the information that we're looking for. So it's important that we consider how we're asking these questions and the structure in which we put our questionnaire together. So after we have conducted the questionnaire, we have to analyse our results. And generally we're going to have data that is either quantitative or qualitative. So the data that we gain from closed questions or ratings questions is going to be quantitative. It's data that we can put a number on. And because of that, we can display that in the form of charts or graphs. So quantitative data is, as I said, data we can put a number on. Gives us opportunity to say something like 70% of people found that blah, blah, blah. Or 4 out of 5 people found that, X, Y, Z. We can put a definitive number on a statement because we have the data there to back that up from our closed or our ratings questions. Analysing an open question can be a bit more difficult because it's qualitative data. We have it's people's opinions, whether that's written or recorded. It's more difficult to put a number on that because it's spoken word, it's written word, and it's a bit more difficult to put a definitive number on that. So if we're trying to analyse those results, we might have to generalise them. So we could say something like the majority of those surveyed said, or most surveys indicated, the most responses indicated this. It's more difficult to put a definitive number on that kind of data. However, the advantage we have with qualitative data is we can pull direct quotes. So if a particular respondent gave a particularly useful piece of information in their opinion about a particular question, we can quote directly from that. And generally that can be quite useful for us as designers. When we conduct a questionnaire, it's generally going to be with a targeted group, which is not the case for conducting a survey, which is very similar. So they are very similar in their makeup, but surveys tend to have a much wider audience. Okay, the group is less targeted. Surveys will generally go out to the wider public. They can be conducted in a number of ways. It can be done over the phone, online, or in the street. One of the main differences between surveys and questionnaires, apart from their audience, is the type of questions that will be asked. Surveys will not include open questions. Okay, they'll either be exclusively closed questions or potentially a mixture of closed and ratings questions. The reason for that being is we don't have time to sift through lots of qualitative data. If surveys, which go out to a much wider audience, had open questions where lots of people had a chance to write or speak their opinion, that's going to be a lot of data for us to try and interpret. It's much easier for us as designers to interpret quantitative data, okay, data that we can put a number on and turn into charts and graphs and that kind of thing. So that's the difference between surveys and questionnaires. Questionnaires will have a more targeted group. Surveys will have a much wider audience, and surveys will not include open questions. Product comparisons is another very useful way of gaining information on products, particularly similar products, and we can do that by comparing them to each other. It's often something that we do ourselves as consumers. So if we think of ourselves as consumers rather than designers, it's something that we do when we go out to buy a new phone, for example, or a new laptop or a new games console. We're going to go out and look at what's out there on the market. We're going to look at the features that they have and compare them to each other to try and determine which product is best for us. So commercial comparisons are often done by independent companies, so you might have heard of which magazine or website, you might have seen adverts for that. So that's their business. It's their business to compare products to each other, and consumers can then log onto their website and read their reviews and look at the comparisons to try and decide which product might be best for them. It's also something that we as designers can do. We can compare products to try and improve one that we're trying to design, or to identify a new market opportunity. So if we were designing a new car, for example, we might compare existing models in the market that we're trying to sell our car in, and we might identify a feature that all of these cars have, and therefore our car must have this feature as well if we want it to be competitive. Or we might identify a feature that none of those cars have, and might say, well, this is something we're going to try and include in our product, in our car, to try and make it stand out, to try and diversify a bit from what's already out there. And that's something that we would call a new market opportunity. So the issues or factors being compared will obviously depend on the product. It could be physical aspects of the product, or we might be looking more specifically at the design issues. So we've got an example here of a product comparison between 3 televisions. So we can see the factors or the issues that we are comparing them against are listed down the left-hand side. So we've got screen size, resolution, whether it's a smart TV or not, how many HDMI ports it has, that kind of thing. And then for each television, we have all of the features listed here. So we can use this to compare the televisions to each other and potentially decide which television is the best for us. Test rigs are used to test products. They can be used to test prototypes generally. Sometimes they'll be used on existing products, but generally test rigs are going to be used to test prototypes of products. And what test rigs do is they perform a repeated physical action on a product to simulate extended use. Okay, so the example given here is a chest of drawers. So a test rig for a chest of drawers might repeatedly open and close the drawer to test the open and closing mechanism, to test its durability, to see if there's any snags, that kind of thing. And it will repeat its use again and again and again to simulate how that product would perform over time. If you follow the link that's on screen here, which is bit.ly/testrigs, it will take you to an interesting video from IKEA and their product development lab, where you can see test rigs in use in real life. The next technique that we are interested in is a user trial. Now we're going to have a look at user trials and user trips, and we're going to be very specific as to the difference between the two, because it's important that we don't get confused between them, because obviously they do have a very similar name. So with a user trial, the product is tested by real users, and these users are going to give a set of standardized tasks, and it's going to be in a very controlled or experimental environment. So the design team will enlist real users to come in and test their product, and the design team will give them a list of tasks that they want them to perform. Okay, the results of these tests will generate problem lists, so we would identify problems with the products, which then allows the designers to go back into the development stage and look at ways in which they can improve those products. So they might be used, user trials are often carried out with existing products, but they're also very useful on using, on pre-production prototypes of products. Okay, so before the product goes into mass production, a user trial can be very useful to identify potential issues with that product. The data is gathered by observing the users during the trial. So the design team will observe the users as they carry out these tests and will record them, and potentially will follow up with a questionnaire at the end as well. So user trials can be very useful at identifying various issues with products, including safety, ergonomics, economics, functional or performance issues, environmental concerns, durability, and also aesthetics. Okay, so user trials can be very useful at identifying issues across a wide variety of design factors. User trips, okay, similar name, similar in some respects, but not entirely identical to a user trial. So we'll look at the difference between the two. User trip involves the designer going through the process of using the product or the prototype. So whereas in a user trial, it's real users that will use the product, in a user trip, it's the designer who is using the product. Okay, there is no standardized list of tasks for the designer to complete when conducting a user trip. When they are trialing a product in a user trip, the designer is going to simulate everyday use. Okay, so from unpackaging the product to assembling the product, potentially charging the product if it requires that, disassembling the product at the end, storing the product, all of those kind of things. Okay, so it's a much more real test of the product, if you like. It's less controlled than a user trial would be. It produces similar results to user trials. It will produce similar problem lists that a user trial would do, and will allow the designers to try to solve those problems before the product goes on to mass manufacture. Okay, so because the user trip is trialing the product in as close a way to everyday use as possible, then the conditions in which that is carried out have to be similar. So if we consider a shaving razor, for example, often that's going to be used in a bathroom, which is obviously a wet environment. So if a designer was conducting a user trip on a shaving razor, then they're going to have to try and simulate the bathroom environment. They're going to have to use that product in a wet environment so as to get a true representation of how that product is performing or would perform in real life. The design team will either record each other carrying out these trips, or it might be the designer themselves recording their own results, and there can be a variety of methods for doing that, whether it's notes, photographs, taking a video, or, as I said, the design team observing one of their teammates conducting the trip. So just to summarise the differences between user trials and user trips, because the names are very similar, it's important that we understand the difference. A user trial is carried out by real users that have been invited by the designers to carry out this trial. It's in a controlled environment, and they will be given a specific set of tasks to perform. The feedback is gained by observing the users as they conduct these tasks, and will usually be followed by a questionnaire from the design team. In a user trip, it's carried out by the designer themselves, by the design team. It simulates everyday use of the product, so it's less controlled than a user trial would be. So that will include the setup, the assembly, the disassembly of the product, and like I said, charging, that kind of thing, if it needs to be charged. And the results are recorded by the design team themselves. So to summarise, we have covered the differences between primary and secondary research. We have looked at the key stages of the research and evaluation techniques that are listed here. And throughout the year, by building our knowledge and developing an understanding of these techniques and applying them in real world situations, we'll be able to carry out and present effective research when it comes to the final assignment.